Hi.
You're saying hi to?
You.
Why?
I don't know. I feel weird.
In the last couple of episodes, we introduced the Noetic oracular deck, which is a new method of divination and a corresponding set of cards and symbols that can be used similarly to tarot, but with different goals. One central thing that we talked a lot about was how the N.O.D. and specifically Austin Osman Spare's approach to a personal oracular deck is Gnostic as opposed to dogmatic, which the traditional tarot falls more into this dogmatic tradition of a particular symbolarium and a particular way of interpretation. Whereas our new approach really loosens that up a lot. And a lot of it is about the process of interpretation more so than the actual symbols that are there, although clearly the symbols are important as well.
It's interesting that you bring up the dogmatism of a traditional tarot deck, because at the turn of the 20th century, when this was going on, all those people, the Golden Dawn Society and all those people, all the Freemasonic groups were making up ancient dogma to give tarot some weight,
Yeah.
There was stuff dating back, I think like the earliest tarot deck is from the 1500s. But they were all saying that these secret arts go back to Egypt, the oldest people we can think of right now, there's really no evidence of that at all. Until, as far as I know, Austin Osman Spare was the only guy that was like, that doesn't matter.
Right.
And that did lead to the creation of this deck.
I think the early 20th century occultists were really kind of fixated on this idea of really their system within this historical context, this really long-running, ancient, incredibly powerful historical context. And that's fun. Like, I don't really have a problem with that from a kind of myth-making perspective, but ultimately I think that kind of buries the true utility of tarot. Samuel R. Delany in Nova, which is one of my favorite novels of his, uses tarot a lot. There are it's super advanced spacefaring civilization, but they still use tarot. And there's a point where one character is kind of explaining it to another. He's like, look, yeah, I mean, like, there are a lot of like pseudo-mystical ways that you can look at this, but humans have been using this system for a really long time because it has this cultural interpretive context. It's really about what you're thinking and not about this kind of like external force that's governing everything. And he gives this really straightforward, like, I don't care if you don't buy into woo-woo shit. This is useful. This does something for you when you go into it in good faith and try to think about it in a serious and critical way. For me, I think for a long time, I thought tarot was kind of fun or cool or whatever. But when I read that, I was like, oh, great. This is just part of a psychological experience that we can all kind of take part in and gain something from.
Right. That's a very the Jungian approach to it, right? And what kind of got him kicked out of the nascent psychological discipline.
Right.
Or at least according to the Cronenberg movie that I like.
Oh, I've never seen that. I should watch that sometime.
Oh, it's real good. It's real good.
Cool. Yeah, I mean,
it's all about how Jung was telling Freud, we need to look at this at the occult stuff because clearly something psychological is going on there. Freud was like, no, we're so new, we need to look like science more. We can't go touch the I Ching, ruin any reputability we have, and I'm already doing that with my obsession with cigars.
And sort of notably, Jung's, it's really hard to get a hold of his book on the I Ching. The Jung's Red Book, I've tried to get, I go to a Jungian psychologist, and she's like, yeah, I mean, she's down with all of this stuff, and she's like, yeah, I mean, if you can get a hold of the Red Book, then it's probably pretty useful. But like, you can't get it because I think that even now in the sort of popular psychological paradigm, it's still a little further out there than people are really willing to go.
Sure. It's also huge.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a big part. And it's got all these like drawings, and probably reproduction is a bit of an issue with that. But I don't know if there were a good affordable version of it that I would be very interested in digging into it. I feel like generally the part of the thrust of a lot of Jungian psychology is about understanding one's own, like one's relationship to spirituality and what that actually means in a personal way.
Sure.
And that can be things like figuring out masculinity, or it can be figuring out what your dreams are telling you. It can be figuring out a whole lot of things that aren't necessarily like, bathing in blood during a full moon. Not that I'm necessarily opposed to the super witchy stuff, but I think that it's important to recognize that there is a heavy spiritual element to modern psychology, and that's important and useful. That doesn't make it less scientific. It makes it more useful to human being, because we can try to understand things in a super dry scientific way, but we don't feel it the same way that we feel a religious experience. Sure. Or an intense emotional experience.
Yeah.
Those things are real. They're maybe not scientific, or maybe they can be, if you're a material reductionist, you can say that this is just chemicals moving around, and different experiences create different chemicals. But nonetheless, your experience of those is a really visceral and vital part of human life. And so if you're not willing to engage with that, you're missing out on a lot of really important context for being.
Yeah, totally. I also think that it's interesting to note that this is a battle of dogma versus gnosis within psychology, that like the people who are like, no, we must be respectable and scientific, they're saying your Gnostic approach to this discipline of let's get in touch with our personal symbols can't be applied universally or dogmatically,
right?
So it can't count.
Yeah,
even though it's really as you say, the heart of the discipline. Psychology is outside of quantum mechanics. It's science's closest touch with the divine, I think.
I agree. Yeah, I think that psychology is a soft science, to be sure, and attempts to make it hard suck all of the life out of it. So if you're reducing everything to chemicals, I think medication is really useful and important to a lot of people, and I'm certainly not down on people taking the medicine that they need to achieve more of what they want in their own lives. But ultimately, you can't look at that as a full cure for something that's wrong with you. Taking this pill doesn't mean that you're done. It just gets a lot of this chemical stuff out of the way so that you can do the work. So that it opens a door to yourself that you didn't have open before. And that's why medication and therapy are really important to happen together.
Or at least a discipline to adapt your behavior in addition to the drugs. This is making me think of that scene from The Matrix that now we can't talk about without having it be too political, but the like choose the red pill or the blue pill thing.
Yeah.
But he says like, this is just a symbol of your intent to enter this whole new life.
Right.
And I think that that's kind of something you need to think about with every drug. Otherwise, you end up letting the tools use you instead of you using the tools.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something too. They're seeing now that LSD can be a really useful tool in defeating addiction. It's not like you don't just take LSD and then you're not addicted to whatever anymore. There's an intentionality to it. You have to go into that experience with the understanding that this is something I want to achieve here. And I don't think that all psychedelic experiences have to be super targeted or have a really like defined goal and that you're looking for. Sometimes it's just fun. Sometimes you learn things that you didn't know that you wanted to learn. And that's really important. But also understanding that, hey, like I can guide these experiences. I can use chemicals and religion and psychology and stuff to actually move in a particular direction. But I have to approach that with some intentionality.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So having said all that, so I developed this spread by taking ancient concepts that I didn't fully understand and then applying them to this to give it some sense of credibility. I'm not saying that what they were doing, you know, calling your new club the ancient rite of Memphis and Mizraim, isn't a useless act in and of itself. It's not necessarily the play of a huckster, although huckstering did occur. But taking these symbols, and then when you recognize that, oh, I'm taking this out of its own context and bringing it into this alien context and reinterpreting it, and that's the use of this, you know? Philip K. I don't know if you ever read Philip K. Dick's Exegesis. It's a slog.
Yeah.
But the team of academics that annotated it, they keep pointing out, like, Philip K. Dick doesn't know anything about philosophy. He's never gone to school, and all he had was a desk reference guide to philosophy. So he's taking all of these words and using them to mean a thing that he completely made up. But the thing that he made up is awesome.
So much of philosophy is taking a word that another philosopher used and saying, I don't think it means that, and then redefining it and then contextualizing it in your own framework. That happens. Hegel and Heidegger had different versions of Dasein. That's a really critical development in philosophy when somebody says, you meant this one thing, but I think it means something else. Karl Jaspers meant a different thing. When Karl Jaspers talks about existenz, he's talking about what Heidegger meant with Dasein, but they still don't exactly mean the same thing. So there's always this tension of language in philosophy where you're saying, let's redefine this. Let's think about this differently because I think it's going to be useful in this different context.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. I think it can be frustrating for true academics to be like, all right, well, that's not exactly what Aristotle meant by that, but okay, let's try to work with this. But that's all that philosophy is for the most part, is just finding new definitions.
The established priesthood is always going to have trouble with the mad prophet coming out of the desert, I suppose.
That's why we have movements in philosophy. That's why we have movements in general. Science and academia and everything does build on itself, and a lot of it is in response to itself. But if you just took everything that came before and said, yes, and this, then you wouldn't have movements. You would just have new additions to old thought. But instead what happens is you say, yes, no, maybe, okay, yes, I don't think that's right. Also, here's what I think.
Because I feel like we're getting dangerously close to a place where we're saying dogma is bad and there's no use for dogma. And there definitely is. I've seen a compelling argument that moving through a dogma is what gets you to a gnosis. You have to go through this process of these are the rules and you must discipline yourself to follow these rules before you can figure out, oh, and someone made these rules up and so can I.
I think that makes sense given what our previous conversation about technology.
Sure.
Particularly how the Catholic Mass is engineered in a particular way to evoke an experience. And that's one part of why it's very powerful. Any technology has at least the possibility of being dogmatic, because technology, sort of by its very nature, it has to work in a particular way. It has to be fed this kind of input in order to get a particular output.
Right.
And so when you're working with a really particular technology, then there's the possibility of there being a dogmatic use of it.
Sure. In keeping with the technology thing, it's like it makes me think of farming implements before the Industrial Revolution. I had a couple when I was younger. I don't know what they were or what they would possibly be used for. They were they're just strange blades lashed to sticks that at some point somebody was like, I need something that will do this extremely specific thing. So they made it, which is a gnosis.
Right.
And then after the Industrial Revolution, you didn't have to be a genius to come up with this one tool that will fit this one job that you had right now. There is a standardized set of tools that will solve anything that anybody gets to use. Now nobody's coming up with this genius implement for this one-time use because they don't have to.
Seems like there's a feedback loop then between gnosis and dogma, where one person's gnosis can become codified into dogma, and then later on a reaction to that dogma can result in further gnosis. I mean, it's kind of like what we were talking about with any psychology or anything. So you have this moment of understanding that then gets implemented in a broad sense, and then you have reactions to that later that either refute it or modify it or redefine it.
Right, yeah. Dogma, if you don't have dogma, then everyone has to be a genius. But if you only have dogma, there are no geniuses.
Right.
And this is the history of religion. I had my anthropology of the Bible teacher said the Bible is a series of books about mad prophets coming out of the desert, establishing a social order that really works, and then priests adapting that social order to be a universal thing that we all can deal with and not be a genius, which inevitably becomes hidebound and too dogmatic. So a new mad prophet has to come out of the desert. And this is written into the earliest historical religion in Sumeria. The first god is Enki, who then is overtaken by his older brother Enlil. Enlil is chieftain of all the Sumerian gods. In the Sumerian version of the flood, Enlil is the one that's like, I will destroy all of humanity. And Enki is the god that's like, build a boat. Right from the beginning, you have this, the first god is this god of revolution, the god that makes humanity, the god that gives humanity all the tools of civilization, agriculture, and stuff like that. But then Enlil, the god of the established order, is the actual god of agriculture. Each Sumerian god had its own city, and people who ruled the king, who would rule all of Sumeria, never came from Enlil's city. But every king had to go to Enlil's city to be made into a king. He's the established order. But the older god, Enki, is the one that's always overthrowing that order. So you have, and they're brothers. And so you have this whole dogma, gnosis, brotherhood right from the beginning, but they're always at odds with each other.
You also see that borne out in Greek mythology with the early gods, the Olympians, and even the Titans kind of thrown in there as an additional point of tension. Or you can see it in Zoroastrianism with this idea of the creator god and the ruling god being different, potentially at odds with each other.
In Greek mythology, you get a really cool thing in the youngest generation of gods that Nietzsche latched onto, where you have Apollo and Dionysus. Dionysus is the god of revolution. Apollo is the god of established order. And Dionysus is the one of those two that becomes king of the gods at one point. Apollo never becomes king. He never sits on that throne, even though he is I mean, Athena is really the person that we go to as the classical embodiment of our ideals, I suppose. But really, it's Apollo. Like Apollo is chief of the muses. Apollo is in charge of mathematics. Apollo is our culture, at least according to Nietzsche.
I was thinking that there's this, we see that a lot in kind of modern arguments about legalism. You know, there's this whole idea that protesters are doing something wrong because they're not following the rules, that there's this sort of conservative conception of civil disobedience as this thing that you shouldn't be doing. So if you get tear gassed or whatever, it's your own fault because you should have followed the curfew, or you should have just done what the cop told you to do, or whatever. The problem with that is that those are the same people who, you know, name themselves after the Tea Party,
Right.
the Boston Tea Party, which was an act of civil disobedience. The founding fathers didn't want to pay their taxes. That was the whole point.
Or didn't have assault rifles.
Exactly. Well, yeah, exactly. So you have to now, if you want progress, you have to do everything within the framework that we have. And the problem with that is the framework does not want that. The framework is built so that it preserves itself. And so anytime there's this movement to break out of that or modify it or throw it away, there's this strong reactionary current that says like, oh no, like not this way. This isn't the right way to do it. You have to go through this process.
All this is interesting because the patron god of science, Albert Einstein, is the one who totally blew up all scientific dogma by saying, you know what? If there's something that we can't experience, we can't detect it at all with even instruments, then there's no such thing as ether. You know what? There's no absolute time. All time is relative in a physical way if you go fast enough. So it's interesting that they're still like trying to have this absolute framework when science has proven there's no absolute. And the other thing I wanted to say that it's also in modern artistic movements. I feel like this is what postmodernism is about in a way of like, we have this gargantuan body of symbols that we have to adhere to, but those symbols are made up. Nothing means anything, which was an important and revolutionary thing in the middle of the last century, but it happened. And now I feel like we're very much suffering from this, like, oh no, we realize that nothing means anything. And we're forgetting that that meaning comes from us.
And I think that's something
and we're forgetting to put the meaning back in, that like a world where nothing means anything is an empty, hollow world.
And that's something that I think is implicit in a lot of existentialist writing, like Camus in particular is someone who's saying like, yes, it's all meaningless, but that means that we get to create the meaning. That means that we get to decide what is meaningful in this context.
Even more so, if you don't put the meaning in, somebody more dogmatic will.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why the Nazis get all the symbols now.
I think it's very complex. Like Richard Rorty talked a lot about the liberal ironism is what he called it, which is a pretty contentious philosophical standpoint, but one that I think is at least compelling, where there's this sort of existentialist moment of understanding like these words are made up. They don't mean anything in and of themselves. They don't stand outside of time as these Platonic ideals. Like they are just what we make of them. But we have to, in order to live our lives and in order to progress in the world, we have to make some assumptions, at least take some things as at face value. So if you tear everything apart and leave nothing left, then all you get, right, is the dogma that somebody else is going to enforce upon you. He talks a lot about it in terms of words, like this lexicon. So if you're able to take a particular lexicon as real even if you're understanding this isn't quite real, this is subjectively real, then you at least have a basis for interaction. The sort of ethical thing to do in that case, the liberal project of that, is to continually expand that lexicon. You continually expand the range of things that you can consider to be real or valid. And so in doing that, you're taking into account other people's experiences and validating them. So if you're constantly growing that, eventually your lexicon and your circle of understanding and your kind of cultural experience includes everybody, so that you don't have to have this othering that continually happens in your life. And you can embrace these things that are different because you can also understand how they are similar.
And all of this is very much reflected in the spread that was made up for this deck.
Right. In the next episode, I think we can start to talk about the spread of the cards, what the different positions there mean, and how that spread sort of stands in relation to previous versions of divination spreads, and what that means for the N.O.D. as its own process.
Far out.
Far out. Thanks for watching. Give us a like and subscribe to the N.O.D. on YouTube. You can also find us as a podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. And if you want to stay up to date with the Noetic Oracular deck and be notified when it's available for pre-order, be sure to sign up for our mailing list. The link is in the description.